Our story begins in a hospital. A man with grey hair is lying in a bed receiving an IV with his daughter by his side, and he tells her that it's too late for her to try to be a good daughter to him. The short-haired young woman then thinks about this since, in the first place, the man never treated her like a daughter, but she wishes her father well for the surgery. The man, without looking at his daughter, says that if he dies, she should not dare to attend his funeral. She then leaves, thoughtful, as she is the only one bothered by the lack of affection between them, but still confirms to her father that she will not attend his funeral if it happens. The woman then leaves, saddened by the situation, as even on his deathbed, her father refuses to look her in the eyes and treat her kindly. She would like to know the reason for her father's hatred towards her, but never knew. In the corridor outside the room, a brown-haired woman sats a man slightly taller than her, questioning his courage. The man's daughter then sees the scene in shock, and the very handsome man, by the way, apologizes to the woman. The handsome man explains to the woman that Yoon-hae is talking to someone and will take a few minutes. The man's daughter, who was approaching, is astonished to realize that she knows the handsome man, calling his name in her thoughts, Dojin. She then confronts the woman who had slapped Dojin with visible anger, leaving the handsome man stunned and holding her hand, pulling her slightly away from the woman. The short-haired, brown-haired woman looks at the man's daughter with disdain, crossing her arms, and asks what she thinks she is doing there. This visibly older woman than the man's daughter approaches her and orders her to leave with that bastard, referring to Dojin and bumping into the girl's shoulder. The girl then grabs the older woman's arm in anger and demands an apology to Dojin, her husband, since, according to her, he did nothing to deserve the insult. The older woman then pulls her arm back, looking mockingly at the girl who looks like a porcelain doll, saying that she is ambitious and certainly forgot her manners. The girl then tries to go after the older woman, but is held back by her husband, trying to calm her down. We then discover that Yoon-hae is the porcelain doll wife of Dojin. Yoon-hae then questions about her family, which she used to want to cling to, but they only hurt the man she loves. The handsome man then tries to calm his visibly nervous wife, asking how the conversation with her father went. She then stares at him and asks how he knew she would be there, as she had not told him, and Dojin then boasts about his good instincts. The porcelain doll then asks Dojin how his cheek is since it's visibly red, and he says it doesn't hurt much. In a romantic moment, Yoon-hae tells Dojin that she can't hide anything from him and says to herself in her thoughts that he is all she needs. At night, in the beautiful house of Yoon-hae and Dojin, illuminated by 2 street lamps outside, the couple is lying in bed, with Dojin reading a book and Yoon-hae hugging his arm. Yoon-hae looks at Dojin steadily and apologizes to him for being insulted because of her. Dojin, visibly upset, says that the older woman was wrong and that it wasn't her fault, so there is no need to apologize. Yoon-hae sits up, facing the handsome man, and says that he shouldn't accept what her stepmother said so casually, since she only insulted him that way because she had nothing bad to say about him. She continues, stating that there is no man in the world more perfect than him, and that her stepmother didn't know what she was talking about, but then falls silent, blushing with the kiss Dojin gives on her cheek. Dojin then looks into her eyes and says that he doesn't care what other people say, he just wants to be the perfect husband for her. He holds her face close to his, making Yoon-hae's eyes sparkle as she looks at him. She then sees how perfect her husband is and jumps into his arms, kissing him. But in the middle of the kiss, Dojin pulls away slightly from Yoon-hae and tells her to calm down, leaving her confused. Dojin then, embarrassed, covers his face a little and says it's that time of the month for Yoon-hae. He looks at her with a flirtatious look and tells her not to get him excited like that. Yoon-hae, giving us the certainty of which time he is talking about, climbs on top of him and says that they can find a way, leaving him really flustered. Another day, while Yoon-hae is preparing a romantic dinner, we discover that she is trying to get pregnant, but knows she shouldn't since both of them have been working too much lately. However, they should take a day to go to the hospital next week. Yoon-hae uses roses to make a heart on the bed, lying down next to it and waiting for Dojin, telling herself that they should enjoy this weekend. Dojin has a vacation home deep in a forest, making it clear that besides being handsome, the man is also rich. Lost in her thoughts, Yoon-hae thinks that there they have no neighbors to worry about if they stay up all night. In this vacation home, they had their first night together. It is their little hideaway, which is not little at all. Eun-hee then leaves the room, checking the time, and realizes she has prepared everything earlier than expected. She then sends a message to Dojin, suggesting they spend the weekend at the vacation home. After sending the message, Eun-hee notices an opening in the wall that intrigues her. She then approaches to look and is slightly startled by what she sees. It was actually a secret door leading to a basement in the house that she didn't know existed. Eun-hee then goes down the stairs in the dark, seeing a door ahead. She lights it with her phone's flashlight, opening the iron door. As she enters, she accidentally knocks something over and doesn't notice. When she crosses the iron door, she faces a wooden one a little further ahead. When she opens it, she finds a small room with red light and wonders what kind of place it is. Eun-hee thought it was just a storage room, but the wall covered with various notes makes her think otherwise. Next to her is a laptop, and she moves toward it, turning it on. She comes across a video of a man tied up and sitting in a chair, looking scared. She plays the video, seeing the man cursing someone off-screen, saying he only did what he was told and that it was In-hyul Kim who killed everyone. The man also says that In-hyul knows who to blame and that he would come running if he found out who was behind the cameras. The man slightly turns his neck, revealing a snake tattoo. Eun-hee looks shocked at the tattoo, indicating she might recognize it from somewhere. A different voice appears in the video, asking why In-hyul Kim would come after him. The man then looks mockingly at the question and says that In-hyul wants revenge for someone blinding one of his eyes. The man, still scared, says he will help the person who remains off camera and says he will kill the fool for him. The man then says again that he will help, but the person behind the camera sets the place on fire, not giving the man a chance to plead. Eun-hee, sweating cold, wonders what kind of video this is, as it seems like the man is really burning to death. She then becomes terrified by what she sees, visibly nervous and trembling. Through the fire, she can see the silhouette of a man who says he shouldn't have poured gasoline on the guy, but doesn't seem remorseful. Eun-hee, still frightened, recognizes the voice and the man who says the guy died too quickly because of the gasoline. Eun-hee is sitting at the table with Dojin, looking sad when he suggests they take a trip to Jeju Island. She then asks about the hospital. Dojin then takes a piece of meat with chopsticks and says he already found someone to replace him at work. He then looks at her with a cute expression and says it would be nice for them to spend a weekend together. Eun-hee, feeling tense and avoiding eye contact with the handsome killer, agrees to the trip to the island. Dojin looks somewhat surprised at his wife, probably because she is being a bit cold towards him. He then says she seems strange and asks if she's not hungry. Without saying anything, she takes a sip of her drink without making eye contact. Right after sipping her drink, still avoiding eye contact with Dojin, she tells him about her visit to the basement. She lowers her head and asks if he has nothing to say to her. Dojin looks a bit surprised by what she said but remains silent, his mouth slightly open. Eun-hee grips the handle of the mug more tightly and begins to tremble, probably experiencing an anxiety attack. She starts having difficulty breathing and begins to sweat a bit from nervousness. The handsome man then gives a charming smile and says he has nothing to say after all. She saw it with her own eyes. Eun-hee's eyes begin to tear up, unable to believe what she is hearing. She then bangs her own head on the table, probably in a failed attempt to calm herself. When she raises her mouth, it is bleeding and ends up staining her hands. Dojin then stands up and asks if she expects him to deny what he did after she saw it, but there's no reason for him to deny it. The handsome man then looks at Eun-hee with a strangely attractive face and says that if she had continued, not knowing anything, she would have been happy for her whole life. He then passes his thumb on his wife's mouth in an attempt to clean the blood, but ends up spreading it even more, mixing the blood with Eun-hee's tears of terror. With a start, Eun-hee wakes up holding her cell phone alone in her bed. She gets up, apparently nervous, thinking about the horrible nightmare she just had. She turns on her cell phone to see if there are any messages from her husband, because apparently he hasn't come home yet. With that, she realizes that she didn't send the message telling him to go to the vacation house. However, Dojin is already in the house, in the basement, looking at the computer screen. He is researching the victims of the Mall Mountain killer. A photo of the last victim of the killer appears, crime scene location among others. Dojin plays with a rose petal that he probably picked up from the bed when he arrived. The news says that 4 missing men were found buried on Mall Mountain, one of these men being the one in the video that Eun-hee watched earlier. Angry, the handsome killer tears the rose petal he was playing with and stares at the computer screen. Then we discover that he is actually looking at Eunhai's search history, since he apparently has access to her cell phone. With visible trembling, Eunhai continues reading the news without even imagining that the handsome man has access to her cell phone. She then panics, remembering the video as she realizes that it is really real and that her beloved killed the guy. But then she remembers him saying that he wants to be a good husband to her and thinks that she can't assume such a thing just because of a video. She then remembers her nightmare and is sure that he will tell her the truth if she asks. After all, nightmares don't happen in real life. Nervous, she puts her hand to her mouth, thinking that her beloved would never kill someone with that silly face of his, so she calls him. In the basement, we see through the computer the call she is making, but the handsome man doesn't seem to be there anymore. Terrified, she thinks about why he isn't answering while the call goes to voicemail. She then curls up, hugging her knees, worried because Dojin has never been late like this without notifying her. Eunhai remembers again the video about what the guy said before dying about the man Dojin blinded wanting revenge. She then raises her head with a terrified expression, worried if something happened to Dojin. Eunhai then looks out the window, noticing the strange smell coming from outside. Her house is on fire, and it starts to spread to the point where she can see it from her bedroom window. She then puts her hand to her mouth, terrified and visibly trembling. The little doll then turns to find a place to get out of the house so she doesn't turn to dust. When she opens the front door, she realizes that the flames are everywhere, so she won't be able to get out. Terrified, she remembers that she needs to call emergency services as soon as possible. However, a hooded person arrives behind her, putting their hand over her mouth and nose, pressing a knife to her neck. She looks at the masked person with fear in her eyes, a level that you can feel her fear through the image. The person then cuts her, spraying strawberry juice everywhere. Eunhai falls to the ground on her knees, wounded and choking. Terrified by not being able to breathe and losing blood, she falls to the ground of the burning house. With her back to her, heading towards the fire, a male face is visible. With many tears in her eyes, she has a suspicion of who the person might be. She then musters strength from somewhere and manages to grab the man's pants, asking who he is. The masked man looks at her without saying anything, watching her fall to the ground, probably not breathing. Eunhai wakes up with her necklace glowing and her hair much longer. When she looks around, she realizes that she is in the cemetery where her mother was buried and questions if she is dreaming. She then looks at her hands and thinks it's too real to be a dream, but if this isn't a dream, her throat should be cut right now. Eunhai looks at herself, realizing that her clothes and hair are different, as if she had gone back in time. She gets up from the ground where she was lying, and a hand holds her arm. Then she remembers the day she is living, and the hand holding her is Dojin's, who asks if she is okay. Eunhai looks at him, astonished, as this was the first time they met. Dojin looks at her with a charming gaze, clearly love at first sight. Eunhai is startled by what is happening. How is it possible that she has traveled back in time just like that after dying? The handsome man holds her waist with one hand and her arm with the other while staring at her. He then says she must have twisted her ankle from the fall. Apparently concerned, Dojin looks at Eunhai's arm, asking how she fell and if she feels any discomfort in any part of her body. Eunhai starts crying in desperation, not knowing what to do at that moment. Dojin, confused, asks if it hurts a lot and that if she can stand, it shouldn't be that serious. He then notices that she is trembling and is left speechless. He then asks for permission, places his hand on Eunhai's back, and picks her up in his arms. Eunhai is surprised by the situation, as she wasn't expecting that. Dojin then quickly explains that he will just take her downstairs, meaning he will help her down the stairs. The handsome man tells her to hold on tight to him so she doesn't end up falling, and they go down the stairs. Eunhai then hugs her husband, who is not yet her husband since she went back in time, and starts crying in his arms. Dojin sits her on a bench next to a taxi sign. He explains that the nearest hospital is an hour away by car, so he will just perform basic first aid. Eunhai says it doesn't hurt anymore and will call a taxi. With that, Dojin says it never hurts when standing still with an enchanting smile. He extends a hand to her and asks if she can stand up. She then stands up, thinking that before and now, Dojin is always very kind. Unable to look into his eyes, Eunhai says she is going to the hospital anyway and thanks him for carrying her. The handsome man looks at her with puppy eyes and sits next to her, saying he will wait for the taxi with her. He gives her a charming smile and says they don't usually come there often, probably referring to the taxi drivers. In-hai looks at him sadly and thoughtfully. He has no idea what is going through her mind when she sees that perfect face. Still thoughtful, she thinks that since she went back in time, she would marry him again and be happy. But who really is the man she loved for so long? Awkwardly, she asks him if there is any chance he knows a man named Jongwon Moon, the guy he had killed. Confused, Dojin says he doesn't know anyone by that name and asks what he looks like. She then talks about the snake tattoo on his neck and almost desperately asks if that reminds him of anything. Dojin, a little sad to disappoint, says he doesn't know anyone with such a tattoo. Then he excitedly, all cute, asks who he is and if he is a celebrity. Looking a bit sad, Yoon-hai questions herself if he really doesn't know who she is talking about. Remembering the video again, she recalls the man's words about someone named In-kyeol Kim being the one who killed everyone and wanting to kill Dojin. Maybe Dojin was blackmailed or had some other reason for doing that, she thinks. Her husband wouldn't do such a thing without any reason. Dojin then slowly moves his hand towards her back, which makes her startle and question him. He then says there's a spider on her back. Scared, she tries to look over her back and hugs Dojin, begging him to take it off her. Still scared, she screams, asking if he managed to get that 8-legged monster off her. With a somewhat tense look, Dojin confirms that he removed the spider from her. After realizing the situation she had gotten into, Yoon-hai stares at Dojin for a moment. Soon after, she pulls away, apologizing and covering her face. Seeing the situation, Dojin starts laughing uncontrollably, making her even more embarrassed. In-hee then removes her hand from her face to look at him and asks him to stop laughing. Dojin then apologizes, trying to stop laughing. He explains that the situation was very cute, which is why he laughed. She then looks at him and realizes that even after everything, she still wants to trust him. Later that night, Yoon-hai arrives home, remembering her father telling her not to dare attend his funeral. She passes by a picture of her parents, thinking she never imagined she would return to that house again. In-hee throws herself on the bed and begins to think that this was the anniversary of her mother's death and when she first met Dojin 9 years ago, among so many other days. Why did she return on this particular day? With some tears in her eyes, she wishes to go back in time to when her mother was still alive. Returning to thoughts of her death, the guy who killed her was probably the one who set the house on fire too, and he didn't even hesitate before cutting her throat. Many questions were swirling in the young woman's mind. Amid so many questions to herself, Yoon-hai begins to wonder if it was Dojin who killed her, but how could he be capable of that? No, he would never do that to her. Yoon-hai starts crying on her bed, missing her husband, and refusing to believe he would do such a thing. She then calms down and has an idea. If she is 9 years in the past, Jongwon Moon is still alive. Of the 4 victims, only Jongwon was killed in a different way. Even if that video is true, there is no proof that the handsome man killed the other 3. Thinking of all the possibilities, she concludes that there must be a reason for Dojin to have murdered Jongwon, and she should be able to stop the murder if she eliminates that reason. She then decides to let the handsome killer just be handsome without the killer part. Dojin is standing in front of a tombstone with a bouquet of flowers on top. He appears sad as he says that the daughter of the person resting there cries every time she sees him. Dojin remembers a scene from his childhood with Yoon-hai, where he told her that his mother had passed away. Yoon-hai started crying and threw the teddy bear she was hugging at Dojin. He then thinks that her life would be much better if she had never met someone like him. At the hospital, Dojin looks disdainfully at the woman in front of him and asks what she would like to say, and the woman seems a bit shy before she starts speaking. She then looks at Dojin shyly and begins by saying she knows he's not interested in a relationship right now, but would like to ask him a question. She then asks if he would like to go on a date with her, and behind some bushes, Yoon-hai is hiding, listening to everything, probably thinking about becoming a beautiful killer. In-hai, with a killer look on her face, continues listening to the woman asking for a chance with her future husband and probably never thought she would see such a thing. She then glances sideways at the woman and realizes she is very pretty. The Dojin she had observed at work was kind to everyone. There's no way he could be a killer. The handsome man then looks at the woman who asked for a chance and says he doesn't think it would be right, and the woman starts crying, leaving him startled. After saying this to the woman, he begins trying to console her, apologizing. Eun-hye then crushes the sodalek she was holding, really wanted to crush the neck of that being hitting on her man. Back home, Eun-hye seethed with rage, remembering the scene from earlier. After her brief fit of rage, Eun-hye stops to think and realizes she shouldn't be so jealous while spying on him, and that following him around isn't making her discover anything she didn't already know from living with him for 7 years. She then looks at her notes and wonders what happened to Dojin to make him a killer. Looking at the calendar, she realizes there are only 5 days left. She remembers something that will happen on that day and remains thoughtful, staring at the calendar. But after all, what is the point of stopping the murder since technically their relationship is just a fragment of her memory? She then decides that she can't avoid Dojin forever and decides to trust him. Determined, Eun-hye adjusts her cap on her head and thinks about facing this head-on. In another part of the city, a busy street is visible. Dojin looks disdainfully at someone and tells the person to be honest. Then, angrily, he tells a man that he's only there looking for a present to avoid going to the orphanage. The man then says that's not true and thought it was good to buy a present since it was Dojin who bought it. Then, while paying for what they bought, Dojin tells the man, who appears to be the same age, that he should visit his mother since he is the biological son, but he says his mother has many children to be proud of and that he would only waste her time by denying his visit. The cashier then asks if he wants to wrap the purchase and tells him the price, and Dojin's brother then notices a person in a mask and hoodie outside and finds it strange. He stares at the person whose face cannot be seen. The person walks past a bench where 2 women are sitting and talking and steals the purse of one of them without her noticing. Dojin's brother then steps out of the store and calls to the person, who ignores him. He approaches the person with a confident attitude, making it clear that he comes from a tough family, and grabs the person's shoulder, ordering them to drop the purse and leave. The man looks at Dojin's brother, who tells him that if he drops the purse, he won't call the police. As he speaks, his sentence is interrupted by the man's actions. The man then pulls out a switchblade from his pocket and stabs Dojin's brother. Feeling the blow, Dojin's brother recoils in pain and anger. The man pierced Dojin's brother's arm, causing him to curse in rage and fall to the ground. When Dojin exits the store, he sees the man running and his brother lying on the ground. He looks at the scene in shock. Elsewhere in the city, we see Eun-hye in disguise, spying on the handsome man. She mentions that he had said he would meet someone before their date. When she approaches the meeting place, she thinks it's too early since they were supposed to meet only at night. The thief, running, heads towards the corridor where she is. The two collide as he probably didn't expect someone coming in that direction. The thief falls to the ground, dropping the purse he had stolen. Eun-hye looks at him with concern and apologizes while holding her own arm where he had bumped into her. The man starts to get up, and at this point, Eun-hye hasn't realized he's a thief and asks if he's okay. But she is startled when she notices that what had fallen with him was a woman's purse. She quickly grabs the purse along with the man, while 2 passers-by stop to look at the scene. The thief looks back, perplexed by the woman's audacity. She stares at him and tells him to wait, finally realizing that the scoundrel is a thief. The man then kicks Eun-hye's shoulder to make her drop the purse, causing her to fall to the ground and startling the onlookers. Someone accompanying a girl shouts, warning about the thief before he runs off again. The thief is then startled to see another man coming toward him from the direction he was running, and we realize that this man is our handsome assassin. Dojin then confidently tackles the man to the ground, pinning him and holding his neck. He stares at the man with a murderous look and is breathless, probably from running. He uses his other hand to punch the thief's face without thinking much. Receiving the blow, the thief reaches for his switchblade in his pocket with the intention of stabbing Dojin. Eun-hye, noticing what he's reaching for, looks at the scene in shock. Without thinking twice, she jumps onto the thief's hand in an attempt to save Dojin, seeing that he's in danger. However, this action distracts Dojin, who is kicked by the thief and knocked off. Before falling, Dojin looks at Eun-hye, trying to understand the scene. When he falls, he realizes what's happening, and Eun-hye looks at him in fear. The thief grabs her hair and angrily threatens her, saying that if she gets in his way again, he'll kill her. Dojin gets up, holds onto the wall, and asks the thief what he thinks he's doing. The thief then says it's the handsome man's fault for interfering where he shouldn't have, and orders him to step aside while threatening Eun-hye with a knife to her neck. He looks at the man with fury in his eyes, The thief then speaks again, telling Dojin to move or he'll kill Eun-hye, who is very tense about the situation and tries to remember if her husband had ever told her anything about this. Her eyes start to tear up, thinking she might have put Dojin in danger because it was her fault for grabbing the guy. She begins to worry because the past is changing because of her. Dojin starts approaching the thief, who quickly asks if he thinks he doesn't have the courage to kill her. Still in her thoughts, Eun-hye realizes that besides changing the past, she is altering it for a worse future. Dojin stares at the man with an absurd coldness in his eyes, and the man reiterates that if Dojin doesn't move, the girl will die because of him. Eun-hye then panics, not wanting to die again the same way she did last time. She looks at Dojin desperately, tears filling her eyes. Dojin then smiles at the man, but maintains his cold gaze, telling the thief to go ahead and kill Eun-hye. Hearing this, she panics and begins to cry, fearing death. Dojin looks at the thief with disdain and says he doesn't care if he kills her or not. Upon hearing these words from her husband, who she thought was so kind, she starts trembling in despair, wondering if this is really the Dojin she knows. Still approaching the thief, Dojin continues speaking, stating that it's different for the man, because he will be caught no matter what he does, and he questions if he's really going to kill someone over a bag. Meanwhile, the man and woman who are still watching the situation probably call the police and start reporting what's happening. Dojin, still staring at the thief, simply says that it's not worth it. He then continues, saying that if the thief had any brains, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing in the first place. The man then smiles and asks who said he would be caught. He then pushes Eun-hye into the arms of the handsome man. She stumbles from the push, and Dojin catches her to keep her from falling. He then apologizes to her, looking somewhat sad. The thief runs off and threatens the man who was calling the police, telling him to get out of the way, and Dojin runs after him. Eun-hye, looking shocked, is determined not to let him chase the thief, fearing what might happen. She shouts for him to stop chasing the man. Eun-hye, who had been wearing a mask, removes it so her shout wouldn't be muffled and begs him not to go after the thief. Dojin stops running when he hears her call his name in desperation. She clutches her mask while crying, pleading for him not to go. Dojin then looks back, confused and surprised at the same time. How could she know his name if he never told her? Back at the initial crime scene, the police arrive and report what happened, saying they will notify them when they find the culprits. One of the officers hands a notebook to Eun-hye and asks her to write down her contact information since it wasn't just a simple theft. While Dojin's brother complains to him about letting the thief escape, Eun-hye looks at the scene, internally grateful that Dojin didn't explain why he didn't pursue the thief, as they might think she was an accomplice. Tense, she wonders what she will say to Dojin when he asks why she stopped him. She then imagines the scene of her saying she can predict the future and that they will get married in 2 years, leaving him utterly confused. She imagines another silly excuse that his name is written on her face. Still thinking of an excuse, she considers saying she fell in love with him at first sight and followed him to learn more about him. She thinks it's better to appear strange to him than a stalker. Dojin snaps her out of her daydream by waving his hand in front of her face, startling her slightly. A bit startled, she asks what he had said since she was lost in her thoughts. While accompanying her home, he apologizes for what he did to her earlier, saying she must have been scared. In her thoughts, she tells herself that she was more disappointed than scared while looking at him. She clenches her hand slightly and says she knows what he did was intentional and that it wasn't his fault. In her mind, she says it doesn't matter much. After all, it's not like they are together. During this conversation, she mentions his name again, and he then looks at her and says he has been thinking that ever since they met. He hadn't mentioned his name, so how did she know? And why did she stop him from chasing the thief? He then stops walking, causing her to stop as well, and asks if she knows him. To Dojin's surprise, not only does she not deny knowing him, but she also says she knows him even before they met. Eun-hye then decides to say that she saw him in a dream and thinks to herself that if he believes her, she can stay close to him and protect him. She continues, saying she had a prophetic dream where he was killed, and that's why she stopped him, fearing he might get hurt. Dojin, confused, looks at her and asks what she just said, that she saw him in a dream, with a look of disbelief on his face. Still perplexed by the situation, Dojin stares at her and continues to ask about the time before they met, and she confirms. Dojin asks if she was following him out of fear he would die as in her dream, and Eun-hye, happy that he seems to believe her, confirms. But then she realizes what she just confirmed and starts to sweat nervously as Dojin continues speaking. He mentions that at the clinic where he works, they don't often see young people, and that she was dressed suspiciously and had a leg cast, so of course, he recognized her. Eun-hye, thinking about what he might think and afraid of being arrested, starts to apologize and says she had no bad intentions in doing that. Dojin smiles at her and asks for her phone. Eun-hye looks a bit tense and asks why he wants her phone. Dojin then says that she can't continue following him in secret. Happy, Eun-hye hands her phone to him and asks if he believes her. He then says that for now, he does. Seeming to genuinely believe her, Dojin asks if her dreams usually come true. Eun-hye says that many times they do. He continues with the questions and asks if she has ever prevented something from happening. Apprehensive, she answers yes. Dojin calls his own number to save it on Eun-hye's phone and tells her to call him whenever she is worried about him. He gives her phone back and says that from that moment on, he will check in with her every day. Eun-hye takes her phone back, a bit shy, and holds it close to her chin. When Dojin starts walking again, Eun-hye says she will catch a taxi nearby. The handsome man then asks where she is going and offers to take her there. Eun-hye then catches his attention and hands him an umbrella, saying it will rain later. He, not being foolish enough to argue with someone who claims to predict the future, takes the umbrella. Later, we see Eun-hye sitting in a restaurant chair with a cup in front of her, looking sad because someone stood her up. She then looks at the messages on her phone, seeing that he said he would be a little late. Looking out the restaurant window, she starts to appreciate the rain falling outside, feeling a bit sad about being stood up. She steps out of the restaurant and sighs because she can't run with her leg in a cast and realizes she will get soaked. She then puts her hands over her head in a futile attempt to stay less wet and walks down the street intending to go home. In front of her stands Dojin with the umbrella, watching her walk towards him without noticing he is there. When she walks past him, he grabs her wrist to stop her, and she looks at him surprised. Dojin positions the umbrella to cover them both and, looking sad, apologizes for keeping her waiting. She smiles and says she is happy he came. He then adjusts the umbrella more toward her to keep her from getting wetter. Eun-hye pushes the umbrella slightly towards Dojin and gently strokes his head, saying he will catch a cold. He quietly calls her name and moves the umbrella back to cover her again, making her blush slightly. She then looks at him and says he is getting wet and offers to let him come closer so neither of them gets wet. Dojin remembers earlier when she gave him the umbrella and thinks about it since nowhere had mentioned it would rain. The rain gets heavier over them. Dojin looks at the sky and says she was right about the rain. He then moves a bit closer to her and asks if she saw in her dream that it would rain that day. Eun-hye begins to think to herself that she had no idea going back to the moment she met him could have been perhaps God's last act of mercy for her. Dojin tries to move away slightly but is stopped by Eun-hye, who pulls him closer, saying he is getting soaked. Looking at him with a loving gaze, at the perfect moment for a kiss, she thinks to herself that they inevitably. Eun-hye arrived home during the dark night, illuminated only by the lights from the windows. In her room, she is packing some things into large cardboard boxes. She then picks up a calendar from her desk, probably to pack it as well. But before putting it away, she looks at it with a silly smile and says to herself that she is happy to have met Dojin that day. She remembers what he said earlier to the thief when he threatened to kill her and thinks that he isn't the same Dojin she remembers, but she knows he is a good person. She then hears her phone vibrate on top of one of the boxes she was organizing. It's an unknown number, but her phone is on top of a newspaper showing the phone number of a former policeman who is now a detective, and it turns out to be the same number. In another part of the city, we see a grey car that looks like an older generation Honda CR-V, maybe from 2007. Inside, Dojin is on a call, asking someone to do him a favor. He speaks seriously to the person on the other end of the line and asks if they could find another person for him and says he will give the details the next day. When the person agrees, he flashes a charming smile and thanks them. After ending the call, Dojin looks at the seat next to him, where the wet umbrella is dripping water onto the car. He remembers Eun-hye talking about her dream where he was murdered. He continues staring at the umbrella, tapping his finger on the steering wheel. He imagines the scene of him being killed and thinks it's nonsense because it should certainly be the other way around. The next day, as the sun starts to set, we see some houses near several trees. We also see the hospital where Dojin works. Eun-hye is sitting on a bench near the place, her head down. She seems to be taking a small nap, arms crossed, probably because of the cold, when someone stands in front of her and places a hand on the bench where she is sitting. When she finally notices, she opens her eyes and blinks a few times without looking at the person. As we suspected, the hand belongs to Do-jin, who stares at her for a while, and she asks if he just got off work. The handsome man then looks at her, seemingly incredulous, and asks if her idea to protect him was to follow him around to make sure he got home safely every time. He removes his hand from the bench and says she can just call him when she is worried. Do-jin then sits next to her, making it clear that this is the third day in a row she has done this, and she responds by saying she needs to see for herself that he is safe. Thoughtful, Do-jin lowers his head and asks why she is going to all this trouble for someone she saw once in a dream. Listening carefully to what he is saying, Eun-hye responds, looking away as if thinking. She then, remembering when they were married, tells him that the dream where he was in was so good that she didn't want to wake up. Confused by what she said, Do-jin says he thought in her dream he died, and upon hearing this, Eun-hye panics, trying to clarify, saying that she didn't only dream about him dying. She moves her hand a bit closer to Do-jin and tries to explain what she means. When Eun-hye says he is special to her, he appears surprised by her confession. Disturbed, Eun-hye takes her eyes off Do-jin, focusing on something in front of her, and says that if something happened to him, she would blame herself forever, and that's how much he means to her. Surprised by what she said, Do-jin looks at Eun-hye with a certain sparkle in his eyes. Eun-hye then smiles at Do-jin and thanks him for believing in her ridiculous dream and letting her try to protect him. Looking sad, he says he's starting to regret allowing it. When she said she wanted to protect him, he had no idea that's what she had in mind. He then looks at her judgmentally, and she says he might miss her later. Eun-hye then, while taking a soda can from her pocket and shaking it discreetly, tells Do-jin that this would be the last time she would see him. In her thoughts, she thinks she doesn't know if it will work, probably considering her brilliant idea of shaking the soda. She closes her eyes and starts to open the soda with her face right above it, telling herself that knowing how tense Do-jin is, this is her best chance. When she opens the soda can, it sprays all over her face, surprising Do-jin, who is next to her. He quickly places his hand over the can to stop it from spraying soda on Eun-hye's face and asks worriedly if she is okay and if it got in her eyes, to which Eun-hye, all soaked with soda, says she is fine. At Do-jin's house, Eun-hye is leaning against the bathroom door, her reflection visible in the mirror. She makes a gesture of happiness that her plan worked and smiles slightly. Showing the outside of the house, we can see that it is already night, and we are certain that Eun-hye is at Do-jin's house, with her thoughts saying that her plan worked like magic. Do-jin knocks on the bathroom door, intending to talk to Eun-hye, saying that he will leave some clothes at the door, but thinks the pants won't fit and she might feel uncomfortable on the way home. Eun-hye is a bit confused upon hearing the part about going home, as that probably wasn't in her plans. Do-jin then asks if her pants are very wet, because if they aren't, she can dry them with the hairdryer in his drawer. Eun-hye quickly throws her pants, which were folded beside the sink, into it, washing them, and says that she already washed them, so they can't be dried with the hairdryer. Hearing this, Do-jin leaves the clothes he brought for her outside the bathroom and says she can wear them for now, but he will see if he can find anything else. Eun-hye then opens the bathroom door slightly to talk to Do-jin. With a mischievous look, she asks Do-jin if he would mind if she slept there since the buses would soon stop running. Do-jin looks back at her, seeing her only in a towel, and asks if she would like to sleep there, then looks forward, appearing tense, and says it's okay. But as happiness is short-lived, while she celebrates internally, he says he will look for a place for him to sleep. As he walks away, she asks what he means by that. He then says there are many motels around, and he would stay in one of them while she sleeps in his apartment. She watches him walk away and thinks there's no point in her sleeping there if he isn't there. Determined to sleep with him, she opens the bathroom door abruptly, making him look back, and she says she would feel very bad if he left because of her. Do-jin quickly turns his back when she walks toward him, saying that she can sleep on the couch or even on the floor. In a moment of weakness, Do-jin ends up looking at her, and she says she won't bother him. Eun-hye gets even closer to Do-jin, holding his shirt, making him blush and try to move away. Dojin then crosses his arms in front of his chest so she can't get any closer to him, because being a killer is one thing, but taking advantage of situations is another. She then looks at him with a shameless face and asks if he will stay there with her. The handsome man tries to move away from her, stepping back, but is forced to stop when he bumps his leg on the couch and tells her to get dressed first, but she pretends not to hear and keeps getting closer. She then pushes him onto the couch forcefully. With this action, they fall together, with her on top of him, leaving him startled. The position they fell in leaves Eunhai's body pressing against Dojin's arms, which are still crossed over his chest. He then closes his eyes tightly, turning his face to the side, and asks if she can get off him, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he's in. Eunhai then slaps the couch beside his face, making him look at her, his face as red as a tomato, and she says she will get off only when he answers her. She lifts herself a bit, but stays on top of him and asks him to say they will sleep together in the apartment. Embarrassed and stammering, Dojin says he will sleep there with her but avoids eye contact. Frightened, he confirms again that he will stay there but asks her to put on her clothes. Eunhai then smiles at him, and as she gets off him, she says that he can sleep in his room as usual and she will sleep in the living room. Dojin says he will sleep in the living room but is startled when the towel looks like it will fall. Quickly, he covers his eyes with his hands, too fast to measure the force he used. Eunhai looks at him, worried about the force he used to cover his eyes to avoid seeing anything in case the towel fell. She tries to get back on top of him, asking if he is okay, and he then says yes, almost begging her to get off him. In a hurry, she gets off, apologizing and saying she will put on some clothes. Eunhai runs to the bathroom to get dressed quickly, leaving Dojin blushing like a tomato. Later that night, the living room of the apartment is lit only by a lamp near the couch. Lying on the couch, swinging her feet, we see Eunhai wrapped up. She is hugging a pillow, looking happy as she remembers that at the beginning of their relationship, she was so shy that she couldn't even look Dojin in the eyes. Remembering the earlier scene of him dying of embarrassment, she finds it adorable to see him at a time when he was so innocent. Eunhai giggles a bit, thinking she wants to enjoy this as much as she can. Then her phone vibrates, indicating a new message. She picks up her phone to check the message and sees it's the detective asking if she can confirm if any of the men in the photo he sent is Min Hyuk Park. She then stops at a photo, looking at it and seeing that it is indeed him. Eunhai sits on the couch, looking at Dojin's bedroom door, and says to herself that she kept him there because that was the day Min Hyuk Park disappeared. But she still has no idea how the handsome man got involved with Jongwon Moon, who was the last victim of the Muon Mountain killer. So what she needs to do now is find out how Min Hyuk disappeared and who was the person that killed him. She stares at the phone screen, thinking about how she can do that. Then an idea pops into her head. What do the police do in situations like this in the movies? After thinking about it, she lies down, frustrated, remembering that she doesn't usually watch those kinds of shows. She remembers that they would be found in 7 years because of a landslide, and until the day she was killed 2 years after the landslide, they hadn't found out anything about the culprit. At that time, the crimes had happened a while ago, so there were no witnesses or evidence of the crime, but this time she would have a chance to find out. The next night, Yumi goes to a supermarket during a heavy storm. Looking at her phone, she discovers that Min Hyuk lived near his college. She thinks about telling the police, but she has no proof of what happened and can't go to them saying she dreamed of someone disappearing. Moreover, Min Hyuk doesn't even know her, and she also can't ask them to look for a stranger. She keeps thinking about this, worried because she has no idea what to do. She then murmurs that she will take a look later when a man approaches her. The man reaches over her shoulder for 2 chopsticks, making her realize she was in front of them. When she looks at the guy to apologize, she is shocked to see who he is. He then turns to leave without saying anything to Eunhai. Tense, she wonders how he can be there at that moment. She looks again at Min Hyuk's photo and turns to the man, seeing that it's the same person, and he is staring at her. Outside, with heavy rain falling, only 2 people are visible on the street with 6 umbrellas. Min Hyuk walks alone on a seemingly deserted street, while Eunhai follows him discreetly, certain that he is really Min Hyuk Park. She wonders how it's possible if he was supposed to have disappeared the day before. She says she remembers his face clearly because she looked at his photo a lot just before she died. As she watches him from afar, she thinks maybe the dates were wrong after all. It happened 7 years ago unless. In-hai looks down, seeming thoughtful about the idea that maybe she changed the past again. Min-hyuk enters his house and closes the door after entering. She stares at the place, seeing that it's the right address the detective said he lived at. In-hai stands in the rain, happy that he is still alive, but thinks the reason he didn't disappear was probably because she stopped Dojin from leaving the house the day before. While thinking this, she calls Dojin. The rain continues to pour. She still stands in the same spot, incredulous at her thoughts since she followed Dojin for 3 nights to see if he would leave. Determined that he has nothing to do with Min-hyuk, she wonders why Dojin would kill him. In-hai starts to cry, trying to believe that it wasn't Dojin who killed him, and even less that he was the one who made her go back in time. Still standing in the deserted place, someone approaches her without her noticing, hitting her with a metal bar. When In-hai falls to the ground from the blow, the man stands there, staring at her with the metal bar in his hand. She wakes up confused and blinks a few times until she realizes what happened. She notices she's in a room lit only by a window with the curtains open. In-hai quickly sits up in the bed where she had been lying, unconscious. She looks at the bedspread and realizes that the clothes she was wearing are no longer the same as before. Then she realizes where she is and wonders what she is doing in Dojin's house. When she runs her hand over her neck, she feels a sharp pain that makes her quickly remove her hand, realizing that it wasn't just a dream. She leaves the room and goes to Dojin's living room, which is only lit by the windows with the curtains open. As she approaches the sofa, she sees Dojin sleeping on it. Getting closer, she notices that he is sweating and trembling, probably having a nightmare. She kneels beside him, wondering if he's not feeling well. She decides to check if he has a fever and stretches her arm to place her hand on his forehead. He wakes up with a start, frightened by her action. He grabs her arm and stands up quickly, leaving her somewhat confused by the situation. Dojin then grabs In-hai's neck with both hands and throws her onto the coffee table in his living room. Struggling to breathe, In-hai tries to call out to Dojin, hoping he realizes it's her. Before he realizes, she notices that Dojin's hands are bandaged, indicating he was hurt. This makes her remember that before she fainted, the man who hit her tried to take her phone, and she clawed his hand. Coughing from lack of air and crying, she continues to wonder why Dojin's hand is bandaged, trying not to believe he was the one who hit her. As Dojin tightens his grip on her neck, he looks scared, sweating profusely, and his eyes start to tear up. In a failed attempt to free herself, In-hai struggles under Dojin. About to pass out and her vision blurring, she makes a final attempt, asking him to stop and for help. Startled, Dojin, with tears in his eyes, seems to finally realize what he is doing. When he releases her, she gasps for air, pushing his hand away from her neck, visibly showing the marks of his grip. When Dojin finally gets off her, she turns to the side, holding her neck in an attempt to catch her breath while he looks at her, tense, trying to understand what happened. Dojin looks at her, panting, trying to apologize, saying he was still asleep when he did that to her, seeming very worried and scared. He tries to approach her, asking if she is okay, but she steps back, telling him to stay away. Frightened, In-hai asks what she is doing there and if he was the one who brought her, while he looks at her with regret. He then clenches his fist and says he received a call. In-hai looks at him in fear as he continues, saying that someone found her lying on the ground in the rain and called his number, which was on the screen of her phone. He then picks up his phone from beside the lamp. He shows her the call log, indicating the call he had with that person, while she watches closely. Looking carefully, In-hai notices that the call was made at 7:30 p.m., exactly when she was attacked. She also sees a call made from her phone there, but the attacker wouldn't have called him out of the blue, and why would he assault her? In-hai takes his phone in her hands to examine the calls, and he then says he brought her to his house because she didn't seem hurt at the time, and he asks what happened. Without looking at his face, In-hai asks why his hands are bandaged. Dojin quickly hides them, saying it's nothing serious. Before he can finish his excuse about cutting himself by accident, In-hai grabs his hand forcefully and says she wants to see how he got hurt, but she is slightly startled by what she sees. Dojin's hand is indeed bleeding, but it's not where she injured the person who attacked her. Looking sad that she doesn't believe him, Dojin pulls his hand back and says it's okay for her to see the wound. As he removes the bandage, he explains that he fell and cut his hand on a piece of glass. Disbelieving, In-hai sees that he has no scratch on the back of his hand, so it clearly couldn't be Dojin who assaulted her. However, seeing his wound, Yoonhae doesn't remember him getting hurt like that before and wonders why the past changed again. Dojin, looking sad, says his hand still hurts, prompting Yoonhae to release it and apologize. Dojin looks at her worriedly and notices that her neck is smeared with blood, so he reaches out to clean it but stops midway. He looks at her face, tense, probably unsure of what to do. She then looks at his hand with a sad expression. Dojin rubs his index finger on her neck to clean the blood and apologizes for scaring her. He lifts his finger under Yoonhae's chin, making her raise her face and look at him while he explains that he becomes a bit sensitive when he's not feeling well. Yoonhae then holds Dojin's thumb close to her face and says it's okay. She moves a bit closer, resting her forehead on his chest, and asks to stay in that position a little longer, thinking it's probably her fault he got hurt since she's going against the future. Still thoughtful, she says to herself that she knows he has nightmares whenever he's not feeling well, but even knowing his pain, there's nothing she can do. With that, a tear falls as she holds his hand. Now we see a door in a dark place with blood on the steps and a noise coming from behind the door. A child is getting his feet bloody while climbing the small stairs, trying to reach the door. But when he gets there, he sees something that shocks him and makes his heart race with fear. A voice then tells the child he should be hiding and asks why he came out. A man with red hair gives a psychotic smile to the child, and the voice says again that there's nothing he can do anyway. A woman being threatened screams for the boy to stay away, and at this point we know it's Dojin, and the woman is probably his mother, who tells him to run quickly. Dojin, all dirty, cries hidden behind a bush, while his house burns behind him. After this, we see Dojin with a scared expression as he sleeps, tormented by his nightmares. Yoonhae stays by his side, wiping his sweat, worried. She looks at Dojin's injured hand, which is clenched into a fist, afraid that the cut might reopen. Yoonhae squeezes his hand to try to calm him with this gesture. She tells him that it's okay, while giving a few pats on his chest. Panting and probably with a fever, Dojin squeezes his eyes shut without waking up. In his nightmare, where he is alone, he hears her voice saying that it's okay. He feels a gentle pat on his head from a plush paw. With this, he looks ahead and sees a yellowish plush rabbit asking what he is doing there alone. He then sees it's a little girl who seems to be a bit younger than him, calling him to play with her. This little girl is none other than Yoonhae. The next morning, the sunlight invades Dojin's bedroom window. He wakes up with the sun on his face and opens only one eye, looking down. Seeing that he's holding Yoonhae's hand, he lets go for a moment, but he's startled to see her hugging his arm while sleeping beside him. He sits up a bit, watching her in surprise at her sleeping with him. Dojin then raises his hand and places it on her face, caressing her, making her smile in her sleep. He admires her for a while as she sleeps and places a hand that was caressing her on the pillow just above her head, blushing slightly. In another part of the city, in a room that looks like an office, we see Yoonhae's attacker looking at her photo with the hand scratched by her. On the night of the incident, we see Dojin holding Yoonhae in his arms, while an older man holds an umbrella for him. The man then asks what happened to his hand, and he says it was just a small cut. While calling his own phone, Dojin tells the man that he will need him to be his witness for what happened. He also says he can't drag her into this. From a higher spot, the man who attacked Yoonhae can see them perfectly, while Dojin says it's safer to tell her she was mugged than to tell her what really happened. The man who attacked her and is in the office removes Yoonhae's photo that he probably took when she fainted. He then smiles at the picture he took and says he won't fall alone. Looking at the paper, we see it's a coupon from a restaurant that can only be used in Korea. The next day, we see Yoonhae lightly knocking on the window of a black car. When the person inside opens the window, she looks at him and asks if he always meets his clients personally like that. The man, a charmer, yawns and says he only does it sometimes since he and his secretary do different types of work. He looks at her with a bored expression and asks if she didn't ask him to follow the guy in secret, and she confirms. Yoonhae, a bit tense, listens to the detective telling her to get in the car so no one hears them. The girl says she has class soon, so she wouldn't get in, just take what he has gathered so far. The man then stares at her, leaving her somewhat confused. He picks up an envelope, looks at it, and asks if she knew he was a former policeman before hiring him. Yoonhae confirms, saying she saw it in the newspaper. The detective then pulls the envelope away from her and says he's not doing it just for the money and asks why she is following that guy. She looks at him seriously and says she doesn't think she needs to provide him with that information. The man, looking bored, says the guy must be important to her since she's spending so much money to find him. Eun-hye then says it's only about money for her and the detective shouldn't worry. She finishes her sentence by saying she has plenty, surprising the detective, who looks dumbfounded upon hearing this. The detective, while looking for something, says she is very naive because it's dangerous to go around saying those things to anyone like she's doing. He adds that she has no idea how many scammers are out there, and she probably doesn't. Already stressed with the man, Eun-hye says that if he doesn't want to do the job, he should just say so instead of talking about those things. The man staples his card to the envelope and tells her to relax because he's only saying these things because he's concerned about her. He then hands her the envelope and says that's his personal number and tells her to save it in her phone after saying he will take care of the case for her. When she takes the envelope, the charmer says she must already know some of the things he found, but that she should read it carefully. She then stares at the envelope a bit after the man's words. At the college at night, Eun-hye talks to someone who must be her professor as she apologizes for her absences and says she will present the work. The woman then tells Eun-hye to remove the name of a boy who didn't do anything on the project and not to let him get away with it as he did the last 3 times. The avenue seems lightly trafficked, with not much traffic. While walking down the street, Eun-hye calls someone and tells herself it's fun to be back at her college. She never managed to have fun before because she worried too much about what her father would think of her. While she walks down the street, we notice a somewhat suspicious man behind her, reminding us of her attacker from the previous night. When she probably realizes she's being followed, she turns around to see if there's anything suspicious. The man, seeing her turn to him, tries to act casual by looking the other way. Eun-hye then turns back around, seeing nothing strange, and starts talking on the phone with Dojin, asking if he had called her. Over the call, Dojin says he wanted to see her for a bit and asks where she is. She says she's at the back gate of her college and asks if he wants to see her now. He says yes, and that he will only need a moment. Eun-hye stops walking and asks where Dojin is. She turns in the opposite direction she was heading upon hearing that Dojin was nearby. She then says she will wait for him at the back gate. She looks in the direction of the man who seemed to be following her and still on the call, asks Dojin if he had been there for a long time and if he was waiting for her. Dojin says he was at a friend's house who had hurt his arm and also attended college there, so he lived nearby. While Eun-hye listens to him, the man following her walks past her. Looking at the deserted street, she asks Dojin if his friend's arm is better. Dojin responds, saying yes, as his friend wasn't badly injured. As Eun-hye walks, she says she thought she had kept him waiting for a few hours or something. Then she stops, startled, and asks what he considers a serious injury just to be sure. Angry, Eun-hye starts to freak out because Dojin needed 10 stitches in his hand, and he said it wasn't a big deal. She asks how he managed to hurt himself that way. She continues talking and says he doesn't seem like the type of person to get hurt like that. While she talks, we can see the man from before a little distance away, still staring at her. Eun-hye quickly looks back, maybe realizing someone is walking in her direction. With his head down, the man gets closer to her, making her wonder why he is coming that way again. The man then lifts his face and gives Eun-hye a terrifying smile. She shivers instantly, and perhaps because of her silence on the call, Dojin calls her name. Quickly, Eun-hye turns back in the other direction and starts walking quickly, asking Dojin where he is and if he's almost there. She says she's near the park and asks if he can meet her there. Frightened, Eun-hye looks back to see if the man is still following her and tells Dojin she thinks someone is following her. In her hurry, Eun-hye trips and falls to the ground. Before getting up, she hears footsteps getting closer and freezes. Probably due to fear, Eun-hye remains paralyzed on the ground, sitting there trembling. Without looking back, she realizes there is someone behind her who asks if she is okay. Hearing the voice, Eun-hye starts to cry and looks back to see who it is. It's Dojin, who kneels to her level and worriedly asks if she twisted her ankle again. She then gets closer to him and says her ankle is fine, she was just surprised it was him. She looks at the street behind Dojin and tells him she thought the man was following her, wondering where he went. She searches tensely while Dojin looks serious and thoughtful. A bit later, we see an apartment, and Eun-hye says that this is her home. Dojin looks at the place, surprised, and asks if she lives there alone. She confirms and says she might move out soon. He looks at her and says he thought she had moved in that week. While looking at her home, Yoon-hae says she really had just moved in. She remembers a conversation with her friends where Yoon-hae had told them she was going to live alone. One of her friends looks at her confused because she had already suggested they live together, and Yoon-hae had refused. Another friend then asks if Yoon-hae's parents' house isn't closer to the college. She replies that she just wanted to live alone. Her friend then asks if she has found a place to stay because it must be hard to find one in the middle of the semester. Yoon-hae says she already found one, signed the contract, and the moving truck had already arrived. She says the place she's staying is called Shianun Villa and is behind the college. The previous tenant left half of the stuff there, so she would keep some of it that was still usable. Her friends look at her in surprise. They stare at her for a moment, leaving Yoon-hae confused by the situation. A friend of hers, who is in front of her, looks at the girl next to her and asks if it's the place she's thinking of. The girl responds yes, leaving Yoon-hae even more confused. They then tell her there are rumors that a woman who lived alone there had disappeared. Back to the present moment, Yoon-hae thinks that maybe the apartment she's living in was the missing woman's and tells Dojin she's a bit scared, looking frustrated. Dojin looks at Yoon-hae, who is downcast, and asks if something is wrong. She tells him she heard some rumors about the place and wishes she'd have discovered them before signing the contract. Dojin puts his hand in his pocket and says he's glad he brought something for her. He takes his hand out of his pocket and hands her a pepper spray, saying it might not work against ghosts, but it works very well against people. Yoon-hae looks surprised and asks if that's why he wanted to see her that day. Dojin says he also wanted to give her something else and then shows her a necklace. Surprised, she asks where he found her necklace, and he says it was on the bathroom sink. She again smiles at him and says it must have fallen while she was bathing and thanks him because she was worried she had lost it. Dojin smiles at her and says it's better for her to go inside soon. Yoon-hae looks at him, surprised, thinking it's still very early for him to leave. She then looks at him sadly and asks if he can come in and stay a little longer since it's her first night sleeping there and she's scared because of the rumors and the guy who followed her. Dojin looks at her, seeming a bit sad. He moves closer to her, tucking her hair behind her ear, and asks if she's not afraid of him. He brushes her hair back and asks if by any chance she forgot that he's a man. Dojin moves his hand closer to Yoon-hae's neck and says that when a woman lives alone, there's nothing more dangerous than men. He moves his face even closer to hers, making her stare at him. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.